Dear hearing people,
we have some things to tell you about us.
Sometimes we use a different language to communicate.
Sometimes we can speak.
Sometimes we don't. Some of us like to wear hearing aids or cochlear implants to hear. Some of us need interpreters to communicate with others. Please don't force us to wear hearing aids or lip read for your benefit.
That is our personal and private choice.
Don't make decisions for us without our participation or permission.
You'd be shocked. We are doctors, lawyers, filmmakers,
race car drivers, teachers,
inventors, CEOs,
chefs, video gamers, musicians, singers,
comedians, writers, and parents.
Need we say more?
Sometimes we're perfectly happy being who we are.
Most of the time, our struggles in society occur when other people make it difficult for us. Sometimes we are too tired to explain ourselves. We suggest
that you simply ask us questions and be open.
Don't be scared. Don't run away. Running away only means that you'll continue to not understand us.
That lack of understanding will only hurt us more.
We're human beings with thoughts and feelings, just like anyone else.
People who are deaf seem pretty happy and content as they are, don't they? They're not longing to hear or be cured. That fact could seem strange to you, but I hope not. The people who are deaf that I've met are as varied as the hearing people. Some are happy with their lives, some are not. In 2007, Gallaudet produced an outstanding 2-hour documentary film entitled Through Deaf Eyes. I'm going to play for you now a 12-minute portion that covers how hearing people saw people who are deaf in the early 20th century and how people who are deaf view their own history. In this clip, you will see some very distinguished and well-known people in the deaf world. Most have been involved with Gallaudet, the prestigious University of the Deaf in Washington, D.C. They are historians, professors, and activists. The last person in the clip is one you might know. Marlee Matlin is an actress, most famous for her role in the movie Children of a Lesser God, produced in 1986. For her role in this film, she won a Golden Globe and an Oscar.
But back in the early 20th century, America was on the planet Earth, not on the imaginary planet of Ith. On Earth, discrimination against deaf people was so much a fact of life that by 1880, they had founded an organization to protect themselves, the National Association of the Deaf. In 1906, the U.S. Civil Service flatly stated that it would no longer allow deaf people to work for the government. So the NAD and its president prepared for battle.
George W. Veditz was the 7th president of the NAD. He was loud, forceful, clear, and not ashamed. He got up and spoke out.
The fiery Veditz launched an aggressive grassroots campaign against the civil service decision. Letters poured in to elected officials. After 2 years of protest, Theodore Roosevelt repealed the guidelines. Deaf people had won the right to work for their country. The deaf themselves fought shoulder to shoulder, a proud Veditz wrote.
George W. Veditz was one of the most well-known presidents of the National Association of the Deaf. He was a beautiful writer, a beautiful signer, really a genius in every sense of the word.
George Veditz knew 4 languages. He raised chickens, wrote poetry, and worked as a printer, teacher, and newspaper editor. He won horticultural awards for his dahlias at the Colorado State Fair, and once earned a draw with the world chess champion in an exhibition match. In 1910, he started yet another project, making movies.
Starting around 1910, the NAD produced films in an effort to preserve sign language, shooting footage of signing masters. They raised funds and then produced a variety of films that showed these masters telling deaf people stories.
Before the invention of film, when sign language was shown, it was static. A drawing couldn't show the movement. The deaf community finally had a way to show what real sign language looked like.
The NAD films were like all the other films from their era, silent. Deaf actors were made for the medium. They could play hearing characters or deaf ones.
Silent films showed deaf characters as being dummies, objects of humor, but at least the deaf person could watch the film and understand it. That was lost after 1929.
Now a gala event ushers in a new era in motion pictures with the premiere of The Jazz Singers starring Al Jolson.
Another party? And what a party. We had to leave before it was half over.
The talkies didn't change one thing. Deaf characters were still stereotypes.
Johnny Belinda won an Academy Award in 1948. The character, Belinda, is seen as this poor, innocent, weak woman. Her deafness makes her even more vulnerable.
The fact that this dummy character blossoms by using sign language was enough. The deaf community was excited and proud of the film, even though the stereotype itself was terrible.
Belinda, searching, ever searching for happiness and understanding, but ready to fight with primitive fury.
I was concerned that my friends would see that character and think that all deaf people were like that.
Hollywood films weren't made for deaf people, but they had been creating their own diversions for years. Deaf communities had theatrical societies, literary circles, masquerade balls, organized debates, sports teams, and travel groups. The deaf culture that had taken root in the schools for deaf children cropped up all across the country in deaf clubs for adults. People came together to sign, to help each other, and quite simply, to have a good time.
My parents were deaf. My parents had many deaf friends. They had an active schedule. We went to the deaf clubs, went to deaf people's homes. It was a natural community for me as a kid growing up. like a kid who grew up in a immigrant family where many of the friends spoke a different language. Instead of speaking Italian, our family spoke sign.
I love you. I love George Washington. I love my country too. I love the flag, the dear old flag of red and white and blue.
In Akron, Ohio, for example, they had a football and baseball team that consistently trounced hearing teams. Deaf people were intensely proud of that accomplishment, proud that their team could defeat a hearing one. In broader society, the status of deaf people frequently seemed inferior. But here, they could level that distance, be seen as equal to anybody else.
Gallaudet had one of the first college teams in the Washington, D.C. area. And legend has it that in the 1890s, deaf players made an innovation that would change the sport of football.
The team would get together and they would sign to each other. And they realized somebody that they were playing against on a hearing football team knew sign language and could read their plays. And so instead of just standing around discussing their strategy, they stood together in a huddle.
Deaf athletes were anyone's equal on the gridiron or the baseball field, but this equality did not apply in the wider world. Most hearing people regarded deafness as a problem, pure and simple, and the general inclination was almost always, fix it.
If you read and study the history of deaf America, you'll find that some parents will try anything to, quote, cure their deaf child.
Fathers like mine who tried different ways for their deaf sons to get their hearing back again. Most common one dealt with for airplane flights. They would fly the plane, bring the deaf boy in the cockpit. The plane would take off and do loops. Hoping the boy would get his hearing back again.
A surprising number of American parents turned to aviation for a cure. In his early career, the pilot Charles Lindbergh charged $50 for what he called deaf flights. But more often, parents put their hopes in medicine.
Doctor put on like a helmet, strapped and put earplugs with rubber caps in my ears. And then it was attached to box, remote control or something. And he said then I'm going to turn it on and it will slowly increase heat waves.
And if medicine did not work, maybe baseball.
My father thought, maybe if Bob can meet Babe Ruth, the Bambino, maybe he'd get a shock, a thrill, and get his hearing again. The babe comes out, says, "Hiya, kid." Me, I shook hands. I was thinking I shook hands with the babe. It was wonderful. But I never got my hearing back. I was deaf as a poster.
My aunt took me to this revival. Then they called me and took me up there, and I stood there in front of the preacher. And he touched my ear and just sort of shook, and he started praying and shouting and shaking me. I was so embarrassed. I didn't know what the hell he was trying to do. I had no idea. And after a while, he gave up. Later, I learned that it was my fault because he said I didn't have enough faith. So that's why you're speaking to a deaf man today.
I'm a proud person who happens to be deaf. I don't want to change it. I don't want to wake up and suddenly say, oh my God, I can hear. That's not my dream. It's not my dream. I've been raised deaf. I'm used to the way I am. I don't want to change it. Why would I ever want to change it? Because I'm used to it.
Now, I want you to meet another person who is deaf, who introduces her experience and culture in an enchanting way. Glenna Cooper is assistant professor and department faculty chair at Tulsa Community College. She has a master's degree from Gallaudet and is a leading activist in Oklahoma, advocating for interpreters in hospital systems and developing a strong program in ASL at Tulsa Community College. Glenna was selected as one of 3 national instructors with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, giving first responders across the country the skills needed to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies involving persons with hearing loss. She also serves as president of the Oklahoma Association of the Deaf.
I'm deaf. I'm very deaf.
My parents didn't know I was deaf until I was 18 months old. My parents' world fell apart, primarily because of the Hearing Society's view on deafness as a negative. My doctor, ear, nose, and throat specialist, told my parents that I should not learn sign language because it would make me isolated from the hearing community. I had to learn to speak and to read lips to fit in with hearing culture. So I did. I grew up learning to speak and read lips, trying to fit in with Hearing Society. And man, it was a challenge. Frustrating. Communication was not always there with 100% access. When I was 3 years old, I spoke my first word, boat. My parents were driving, and out the window, I saw a boat and kept repeating the word. That's, I guess, why I have a 29-foot cruiser today. My parents, upon looking back, realized that the doctors didn't really understand the critical part of language development for infants. It's so critical that deaf babies have a first language, American Sign Language. It's natural, visual language for them to develop as a basis, and then they can learn to speak and read lips later in life. And that's the most important part for deaf babies, to have that critical access, that first language. Today I'm 53 years old. I'm proud to be deaf. American Sign Language is something that I greatly value because it flung the world wide open for me, even more than I had before. I love American Sign Language, deaf culture, and deaf history, and the deaf community. We know we're not disabled. We just have a language, a different language. We know who we are. We can do everything just as you can. We have successful deaf attorneys, deaf doctors, scientists, engineers, college professors, athletes, actors. We even have a deaf receptionist in the White House. When I talk about culture, What do I mean that I love deaf culture? We have a culture just like any other group. Hispanic, Asian, Black, they value their language and their own culture, such as we value our own deaf culture and our own language. So, let me give you some examples of normative deaf culture. We can be really blunt. I mean, if you come up to someone deaf and they say, "You've gained weight, wow, you've gotten fat, what's wrong?" Hearing people will not say that. "Oh, you look good." If that's a bad haircut, we'll tell you, those clothes aren't right for you. Hearing people are so nice, culturally. "Oh, you look good," is all they'll say. It's nice to get that honesty. We typically are very detail-oriented. If someone passes away, we'll ask questions. What's wrong? What happened? How'd they die? And ask for a lot of details. But in hearing culture, they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry if they passed." If a hearing student comes into my classroom, they'll say, "I'm so sorry I was late," and sit down. But if a deaf student comes into my classroom, they'll say, "Oh, sorry I was late. You got to know why, because there was a truck on the highway and it was full of egg crates and it fell over and the police and all the ambulances came in and they blocked the road. I couldn't get through," and on for 2 or 3 minutes, and then end with, "Sorry I'm late." That's part of our culture. We value that information sharing. Let me tell you about, we have a 5-stage goodbye. If hearing friends come over to my house for a party, they'll stay about an hour, hour and a half, and they'll leave. Bye. Oh, okay. But if my deaf friends come over, they will stay forever. I mean, forever, even if I'm urging them to leave. So, if we're in a restaurant together, we'll be talking, and the manager will come up to the table and indicate we're closing in about 5 minutes. Okay, but we don't leave. We're still talking for another 10 to 15 minutes, and we realize it, and then we get away from the table, step a little further away, but we're still talking for 10 or 15 more minutes, sharing information. And then we're standing by the door in a group, and we're talking, and the manager's angrily shutting the lights off and motioning us to leave. That's the 3rd stage. And then we're out in the parking lot, and we're out to our 4th stage of goodbye, and in our cars, still talking. We're still catching up, and finally we leave. That's the reason we really depend on each other to share information. For hearing culture, you typically can hear the radio or talk amongst yourselves to get news and information, whereas we rely on sign language for our information between ourselves, and that's how we communicate. And that's the most important part of our culture. When we talk about sign language is nothing new. It's been here for thousands of years. When we have to fight almost daily to protect sign language, we experience a lot of oppression, discrimination, just as any other cultural group experiences oppression on their cultures, discrimination on their languages. We are the same. Now, looking back historically, in 427 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato, in his essay, Cratylus, the character of Socrates is quoted, "If we do not have voice or tongue, but we wish to communicate our feelings and thoughts, what should we do? Such as those deaf people who use gestures, body language, facial expression, and movement to express their thoughts." And that's the earliest documented use of American Sign Language. It's been here ever since. So here in America, in the 1700s, Martha's Vineyard, the island, there had the largest deaf population, generational deafness. Every 1 out of 25 individuals hereditarily deaf. And everyone on that island signed and spoke. Everyone, hearing and deaf, knew sign language. It was one cohesive community that understood each other. The community events, meetings, everything was conducted in sign language. No barriers. Deaf people were fully included and successful. Now, later on, in 1817, the American School for the Deaf, America's first deaf education, was established in Hartford, Connecticut. That's when many Martha's Vineyard residents from the island moved to that school, and graduates from the American school went on to other states to found deaf schools there, all over the US. And that was the most glorious moment. Well-educated deaf community, college educated, establishing Gallaudet University, the world's only liberal arts university for the deaf, founded in 1864, which provided a college degree for deaf individuals. Many deaf graduates from the American School for the Deaf went to Gallaudet University, and it was the best time for us. We had access to education, we were successful business owners, we conducted business and our lives on equal footing. And 66 years later, in 1880, that was the year we will never forget. It's indelibly etched on our minds within the deaf community. The world delegates convened in Milan, Italy, for the Second International Congress on Deaf Education. There, the delegates voted to forbid sign language and mandated that deaf children learn to speak and read lips, just as Hearing Society does. And that's what vastly changed the deaf world. The result and the impact in America was that they fired all deaf teachers. Most of them couldn't speak. Replaced all of them with hearing teachers who taught deaf children how to read lips and speak. The impact was felt worldwide, and that was the darkest, most oppressive era of the deaf world. Job opportunities vastly declined. The worlds, hearing and deaf, were rent apart. Our world using sign language, hearing world using spoken English. And it was the darkest time we've ever been through. Finally, in 1960, at Gallaudet University, an English professor, Dr. William Stokoe, he recognized that deaf students on campus were signing very fluently and similarly, and recruited 2 deaf researchers to work with him. They researched American Sign Language and finally proved definitively that American Sign Language is its own language, its own grammar, syntax, morphology, mouth movements, hand shape, locations, and the 5 parameters of sign were identified. Spatial movement, facial expression, and that was not a form of English, after all. It was a completely different and separate language with its own rules. People had assumed that sign language was based on English, but it was not. That finally brought our deaf community back to where it should have been all along. The use of ASL flourished. And at that time, many children who had deaf parents, they had been born into that deaf world, had American Sign Language as their first language, and had grown up in the deaf community. Those individuals took on the responsibility as our first interpreters because of our worlds being so separate, and became interpreters, communicating between both the hearing and deaf worlds. But we didn't have enough. We needed more interpreters. It was the baby boomers' time, and we needed more interpreters. So finally, in the 1970s, college programs were established nationwide, all over the US, to train interpreters, and many students who are hearing with no prior knowledge of sign language entered into those interpreter training programs. But we realized that you can't learn the cultural nuances and the language in 2 or 4 years because of the deep roots of our language and the cultural implications. The interpreters themselves experience challenges learning to interpret between deaf and hearing cultures. And then over the years, as interpreting field has grown, now you'll be seeing a new movement. Deaf interpreters taking on the responsibility to be interpreters. American Sign Language is their first language. A full understanding of language and culture intrinsically. They take signed language, interpret it to a hearing interpreter, who will then translate it to spoken English, and back and forth. A team of interpreters, deaf and hearing. So if you look back to the year 1880, and to now, deaf interpreters, we're seeing more of them. We'll see them interpreting in legal settings, in medical and hospital settings, working for a more complete interpretation between our 2 separate worlds, interpreting back and forth. But that year of 1880, if those delegates had never voted to forbid sign language, remember the golden era of the deaf community, the deaf teachers, the children with full access to language, with everyone on one level playing field. If 1880 had never happened and rent our worlds apart, suppose that had never occurred, that vote had never happened. Would that mean that you would be signing today along with us? Signing fluidly, we would be one world. We wouldn't need interpreters. We could go back to those days of Martha's Vineyard and have that experience from then until now. It's a nice idea that we would be one world with no barriers. Back to our golden age of successful deaf individuals, well-educated. It's something to think about. Thank you.